When I moved into the pristine suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook Estates, I thought I had found the perfect place to settle down. The manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and tree-lined streets seemed like something out of a magazine. What I didn't anticipate was meeting Karen Pemberton, the H.O.A. president, who ruled our little corner of suburbia with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of fake pleasantries. My first encounter with Karen came just 3 days after I had installed a comprehensive security system around my property. I had chosen discrete cameras, positioned them carefully to monitor only my own driveway, front door, and backyard without infringing on anyone else's privacy. The system was top of the line, something I could easily afford after my recent exit from the tech company I had helped build from the ground up. The cameras were barely visible, tucked under eaves and positioned behind decorative elements. That Tuesday morning, I was enjoying my coffee when I noticed someone walking across my front yard. Through my kitchen window, I watched a woman in a bright pink tracksuit methodically approaching each of my security cameras. She was carrying what appeared to be a stack of yellow post-it notes, and was systematically covering each camera lens. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside. "Excuse me, what are you doing to my property?" I called out, keeping my voice level and polite. The woman turned around with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was probably in her mid-50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and enough jewelry to stock a small boutique. "Oh, hello there. I'm Karen Pemberton, your H.O.A. president. I'm just taking care of a little privacy issue we have here." I walked closer, noting that she had already covered 4 of my 6 visible cameras with bright yellow sticky notes. "I'm sorry, but these cameras only monitor my own property. You're actually trespassing right now." Karen's smile became even more forced. "Well, honey, that's where you're wrong. According to our H.O.A. guidelines, any recording device that could potentially capture images of common areas or neighboring properties requires prior approval. These cameras of yours are making our residents uncomfortable." I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, showing her the live feeds. As you can see, these cameras only show my driveway, my front door, and my backyard fence line. Nothing extends beyond my property boundaries. Karen waved her hand dismissively. "That's not the point, sweetie. The point is that they could potentially record our residents, and that's a privacy violation. I'm going to need you to remove these cameras or face a fine." "I'll need to see the specific H.O.A. rule that prohibits security cameras on private property," I replied calmly. Karen's eye twitched slightly. "I don't need to provide you with anything right now. I'm the president, and I'm telling you this is a violation. You have 48 hours to comply." She finished covering my cameras and marched off my property, leaving me standing there with yellow post-it notes fluttering in the morning breeze. That afternoon, I received an official-looking letter from the Willowbrook Estates H.O.A. citing me for an unauthorized surveillance system installation and demanding immediate removal or modification of all cameras. The fine was $200 per day until compliance. I spent the evening reading through every page of our H.O.A. covenant, conditions, and restrictions. Nowhere could I find any prohibition against security cameras, only vague language about maintaining neighborhood privacy and aesthetics. The next morning, I removed all the post-it notes and sent a formal response to the H.O.A. board, requesting the specific rule violation and noting that my cameras complied with all local and state laws regarding property surveillance. I also mentioned my background in corporate law and my willingness to discuss this matter reasonably. Karen's response came faster than I expected. By noon, there were fresh post-it notes on every camera, and this time they were reinforced with clear packing tape. A new letter arrived that evening, escalating the fine to $500 per day and threatening legal action for continued noncompliance with H.O.A. directives. I decided to attend the next H.O.A. meeting to address this issue directly. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest building that Karen had clearly claimed as her personal kingdom. She sat at the head of a folding table like it was a throne, with 2 other board members flanking her like nervous courtiers. When I stood to speak during the homeowner comments section, Karen immediately interrupted. "I'm sorry, but we don't allow non-compliant residents to address the board until their violations are resolved." "That's not how H.O.A. meetings work," I replied calmly. "Homeowners have the right to speak during designated comment periods regardless of pending issues." Karen's face flushed slightly. "Well, this is my meeting, and I decide how it runs." Security. Security. She actually called for security at a voluntary neighborhood meeting in a community center. The other board members looked embarrassed, and one of them, an elderly man named Bob, cleared his throat. "Karen, maybe we should hear what he has to say." "Fine," Karen snapped. 5 minutes. No more. I presented my case methodically, showing photos of my camera placement, citing the relevant H.O.A. documents, and explaining how my system violated no actual rules. I also mentioned that I had consulted with my attorney, who happened to be a partner at one of the city's most prestigious firms, and that we were prepared to challenge any continued harassment. Karen's response was swift and predictable. "Your fancy lawyers don't scare me, honey. This is my neighborhood, and what I say goes. Your cameras are a nuisance, and they're coming down one way or another." The next morning, I woke up to find that Karen had not only covered my cameras again, but had also filed a complaint with the City Code Enforcement Office, claiming my security system violated municipal privacy ordinances. She had also sent letters to my immediate neighbors, warning them that my cameras were potentially recording their private activities and encouraging them to file complaints. I spent that day making several phone calls to old colleagues and friends I had met during my years in the tech industry. One conversation was particularly interesting, with a former business partner who now ran a private investigation firm specializing in corporate security and due diligence. Another call went to my college roommate, who had become a real estate attorney with expertise in property law and municipal regulations. By the end of the week, Karen had escalated her campaign significantly. She had posted flyers around the neighborhood warning residents about my illegal surveillance operation. She had contacted my security company directly, demanding they remove the equipment. She had even called my insurance company, claiming my cameras were creating a liability issue for the neighborhood. Most audaciously, she had begun conducting what she called safety patrols past my house, walking slowly by my property multiple times per day while talking loudly on her phone about the dangerous criminal who had moved into the neighborhood. She made sure to stand directly in front of my cameras during these performances, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. The turning point came when I discovered that Karen had contacted my employer, reaching out to the tech consulting firm where I occasionally took contracts, claiming I was using company resources to conduct illegal surveillance on my neighbors. This crossed a line from petty harassment into potential interference with my livelihood. That evening, I made a series of very specific phone calls. The first was to my real estate attorney, asking him to research all available properties within a 3-block radius of my home. The second was to my private investigator friend, commissioning a comprehensive background check and activity audit on Karen Pemberton and her H.O.A. management practices. The third call was to a commercial real estate broker who specialized in unique property acquisitions. Within 48 hours, I had a fascinating collection of information. Karen, it turned out, had a pattern of selective rule enforcement that bordered on discriminatory. She lived in a corner house at the end of Maple Street, with her daily routine including a morning power walk through the neighborhood, afternoon gardening in her backyard, and evening drives to the shopping center 3 blocks away via Elm Street. More interestingly, there was a small commercial property available for sale directly adjacent to the neighborhood. It was a narrow strip of land that had once housed a small grocery store, with frontage on both Elm Street and Oak Avenue. The property had been vacant for 2 years, and the asking price was surprisingly reasonable for someone with my resources. But the most intriguing discovery was a city planning document from 15 years ago, showing that a small section of what everyone believed was public street parking on Elm Street was actually designated as a private easement tied to the commercial property. This easement included the right to control access and parking along a 100-foot stretch of road that happened to be the only convenient route between Karen's house and the main shopping area. I spent the next week conducting careful surveillance of my own, not with cameras, but with old-fashioned observation and note-taking. I documented Karen's daily routine, her continued harassment of my property, and most importantly, her complete dependence on that specific route for her daily activities. She drove past that exact stretch of Elm Street a minimum of 6 times per day. My real estate attorney confirmed what I had hoped. The commercial property was legitimately for sale. The private easement was legally binding and transferable with a property deed, and the previous owners had simply never bothered to enforce their exclusive access rights. More importantly, as the new owner, I would have complete legal authority to control parking, access, and usage of that 100-foot section of roadway. The purchase process took exactly 12 days. I bought the property through a limited liability company I established specifically for this purpose, keeping my personal name off all public records until the final transfer. The property came with all historical rights and easements, including the exclusive control over that crucial section of Elm Street. During those 12 days, Karen's harassment campaign reached new heights of absurdity. She had somehow obtained official-looking badges identifying herself as Neighborhood Safety Coordinator and was conducting what she called wellness checks on houses with security cameras. She had also begun organizing community awareness meetings about the dangers of unauthorized surveillance, though only 3 people ever attended. On the day my property purchase was finalized, I took one additional step. I hired a professional surveying company to mark the exact boundaries of my new easement with small but visible posts, and I contracted with a reputable parking management company to install appropriate signage and enforcement mechanisms. The signs were simple, professional, and completely legal. Private road, no public access, authorized vehicles only, violators will be towed. Karen discovered my little surprise on a Thursday morning during her usual power walk routine. I watched from my front yard, where I was watering my garden, as she approached the newly posted signs with obvious confusion. She spent several minutes reading and rereading the notice, then pulled out her phone and made what appeared to be several increasingly agitated calls. 20 minutes later, she was back in her pink tracksuit, this time carrying a small toolkit. I watched with interest as she attempted to remove one of the signs, apparently unaware that tampering with legally posted private property notices constitutes vandalism under municipal code. By noon, she had called the city planning office, the mayor's office, and apparently every member of the H.O.A. board. I knew this because I could hear her voice carrying across the neighborhood as she conducted these conversations from her front porch. That afternoon, Karen made her first attempt to drive her usual route to the shopping center. The private parking enforcement company I had hired worked exactly as advertised. Her car was booted within 15 minutes of parking in the private easement area, and the removal fee was $250. I happened to be checking my mail when Karen came storming across the street, her face purple with rage. You did this. You can't just buy a road. This is public property." I looked up from my mail with genuine surprise. "I'm sorry, Karen, but I'm not sure what you're talking about. Are you having some kind of property access issue? Don't you dare play dumb with me. You bought that stupid building just to mess with me. This is harassment." I smiled politely. "I recently made an investment in commercial real estate, yes. I believe in supporting local business development, but I'm not sure how that affects you personally." Karen was practically vibrating with fury. "That's the only way to get to the shopping center. You can't just block off a public road." "Actually, Karen, if you check with the city planning office, you'll find that section of Elm Street has been designated as a private easement for over 15 years. The previous property owners just never exercised their rights. But as the new owner, I do intend to maintain proper control over my private access way. This is illegal. I'm calling my lawyer. I'm calling the police. I'm calling the news." I continued sorting through my mail casually. "You're certainly welcome to contact anyone you'd like. I'm sure they'll explain property law to you. In the meantime, there are several alternate routes to the shopping center. Oak Avenue connects to Main Street, which is probably only about 6 extra minutes of driving. What I didn't mention was that Oak Avenue was currently under construction and would be closed for the next 4 months. And that Main Street required a 15-minute detour through 3 traffic lights. And that the construction project had been carefully researched before I made my property purchase." Karen spent the next 3 days launching what could only be described as a full-scale legal assault. She contacted every city office, filed complaints with multiple agencies, and even reached out to local news stations about what she called corporate harassment of longtime residents. Unfortunately for Karen, everything I had done was completely legal. The property purchase was legitimate, the easement rights were clearly documented and transferable, and my enforcement of those rights was well within legal bounds. Moreover, my attorney had carefully reviewed every step to ensure compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. But Karen's most creative solution came the following Monday. She had apparently spent the weekend researching property law and discovered that easement rights could sometimes be challenged if they interfered with established patterns of community use. So she organized what she called a neighborhood solidarity march down Elm Street, encouraging residents to reclaim their public access rights. I watched from my kitchen window as Karen led a group of about 8 neighbors in a slow procession down the private easement area. They were carrying handmade signs with slogans like, "Our streets, our rights," and "Stop corporate bullying." The private parking enforcement company handled this exactly as they handled all unauthorized use of the private roadway. Every participant received a citation for trespassing on private property, and those who had parked in the easement area returned to find their vehicles booted. Karen's phone calls that afternoon were audible from 3 houses away. The final escalation came when Karen apparently decided that if she couldn't use the easement, she would make sure I couldn't either. She filed a complaint with the city alleging that my enforcement of the private easement was creating a public safety hazard by forcing emergency vehicles to take longer routes to neighborhood homes. This complaint triggered a formal review by the City Planning Commission, which meant I had to present documentation justifying my property rights and enforcement procedures. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at City Hall. I spent considerable time preparing for this hearing, not just gathering legal documentation, but also compiling a comprehensive record of Karen's harassment campaign against me. My private investigator friend had provided detailed documentation of her activities, including recorded instances of property tampering, harassment of neighbors, and abuse of her H.O.A. position. The hearing was everything I could have hoped for. Karen arrived with a folder full of complaints, neighborhood petitions, and what appeared to be printouts from various legal websites. She had also brought 3 neighbors as character witnesses, though they seemed uncomfortable and kept glancing around the room nervously. I arrived with my real estate attorney, a briefcase full of properly documented legal materials, and something Karen had not expected, a representative from the city planning office who had personally reviewed the historical easement documents. When Karen presented her case, she focused primarily on the inconvenience and community disruption my property enforcement had caused. She argued passionately that longtime residents should have priority over newcomers with too much money and not enough sense. When it was my turn to present, I simply laid out the legal facts. The property was legitimately purchased, the easement rights were clearly documented and legally transferable, and my enforcement was entirely within my rights as the property owner. I also presented documentation showing that alternate routes were available, and that emergency services had confirmed no significant impact on response times. Then I presented Karen's harassment campaign against me, including photos of her repeatedly vandalizing my security cameras, copies of her defamatory letters to neighbors and city offices, and recorded instances of her trespassing on my property to interfere with legally installed security equipment. The Planning Commission's decision was unanimous and swift. My property rights were completely upheld, Karen's complaint was dismissed, and she was formally cautioned about continued harassment of neighbors and abuse of her H.O.A. position. But the real surprise came 3 days later, when Karen received an official notice from the City Code Enforcement Office. It seemed that during their review of the neighborhood for the easement hearing, they had discovered several violations at Karen's own property. Her garden shed exceeded size limitations for structures built without permits, her decorative fence violated setback requirements, and her elaborate landscape lighting system was not properly registered with the Electrical Permit Office. The total fines exceeded $1,500, and corrections were required within 30 days to avoid additional penalties. I learned about this development when I overheard Karen shouting into her phone from her front yard. She was demanding to know who had filed complaints against her property and threatening legal action against the city for selective enforcement. That evening, I received a certified letter from Karen's attorney demanding that I cease retaliatory actions against his client and threatening a lawsuit for harassment and property interference. The letter was full of legal-sounding language, but was essentially a desperate attempt to get me to voluntarily give up my legitimate property rights. I forwarded the letter to my attorney with a simple note: "Please respond appropriately." His response was swift and professional. He documented the complete legal basis for my property ownership and rights, detailed Karen's months-long harassment campaign against me, and politely suggested that her attorney might want to advise his client to focus on complying with city code requirements rather than pursuing frivolous litigation. The next week brought an interesting development. Karen had apparently decided that if she couldn't challenge my legal rights directly, she would try to make my property ownership as expensive and difficult as possible. She filed a series of complaints with various city departments, alleging that my commercial property was being improperly used for residential purposes, that my parking enforcement company was operating without proper licenses, and that my property signage violated municipal advertising regulations. Each complaint triggered a formal inspection and review process, which cost me time and attorney fees to address. However, each complaint also created official documentation of Karen's continued harassment campaign, which my attorney carefully preserved for potential future legal action. But Karen's most significant mistake came when she escalated her complaints to the state level. She contacted the State Commerce Commission, alleging that my parking enforcement company was engaged in fraudulent business practices. She also filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office, claiming I was using my property rights to engage in discriminatory practices against longtime residents. These state-level complaints were taken seriously and triggered formal investigations. However, the investigations quickly revealed that all my actions were completely legal and proper, while also uncovering Karen's pattern of filing frivolous complaints and making false allegations against multiple parties. The state investigator who contacted me was particularly interested in Karen's apparent campaign of targeted harassment, and he requested copies of all documentation my attorney had compiled regarding her activities. 2 weeks later, Karen received a formal warning from the State Attorney General's office regarding the filing of frivolous complaints and potential abuse of regulatory processes. The letter made it clear that continued misuse of state complaint systems could result in legal action against her personally. I thought this might finally convince Karen to back down, but instead, it seemed to push her over the edge into complete desperation. She began what could only be described as a surveillance campaign against me, parking across from my house for hours at a time and taking photographs of everyone who visited my property. She also began following delivery trucks and service vehicles, apparently trying to document some kind of commercial use violation. This behavior was becoming genuinely concerning, not just annoying. I contacted the police to file a formal harassment complaint, providing documentation of her escalating behavior and expressing concern about her mental state. The police officer who took my complaint was familiar with Karen. Apparently, she had filed numerous complaints against various neighbors over the years, and her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He assured me they would have a conversation with her about appropriate boundaries. That conversation apparently did not go well. The next morning, I discovered that Karen had spray-painted "Corporate Bully" across the side of my commercial property building. She had also left a pile of garbage in my private easement area and had apparently spent part of the night removing the private parking signs I had legally installed. This was clearly criminal vandalism and destruction of property. I called the police immediately and filed a formal complaint. The responding officer took photographs, collected evidence, and assured me that charges would be filed. Karen was arrested that afternoon for vandalism, destruction of private property, and harassment. The local newspaper ran a small story about the incident, identifying her as the H.O.A. president of Willowbrook Estates and mentioning her ongoing disputes with neighbors. I assumed this would finally end the situation, but Karen apparently saw her arrest as proof that she was the victim of a conspiracy involving me, the police, the city government, and probably several other parties. When she was released on bail the next day, she immediately resumed her campaign, this time focusing on trying to organize a recall petition against me. The problem with her recall petition was that H.O.A. board members are elected by homeowners, and I had never run for the H.O.A. board. Karen was apparently so consumed by her anger that she had confused her own position with mine, and was trying to organize a recall election against a private citizen who held no elected office. This confusion became evident when she went door to door in the neighborhood, asking residents to sign a petition to remove the corporate spy from the H.O.A. board. Several neighbors called me to ask what she was talking about, which gave me an opportunity to explain the actual situation and provide them with factual information about Karen's months-long harassment campaign. By the end of the week, I had received calls from more than a dozen neighbors expressing concern about Karen's behavior and asking what they could do to address the situation. Several mentioned that they had been dealing with her arbitrary H.O.A. enforcement and petty power trips for years, but had never felt comfortable challenging her directly. This gave me an idea for what might be the perfect resolution to the entire situation. I organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss H.O.A. governance and community standards. I rented the community center, sent professional invitations to every homeowner in the development, and arranged for light refreshments and proper meeting materials. The turnout was remarkable. More than 40 homeowners attended, representing about 70% of the households in Willowbrook Estates. Karen arrived late, apparently expecting to take control of the meeting, and was visibly shocked to find that I had organized everything professionally and was conducting the meeting according to proper parliamentary procedures. The meeting was incredibly productive. Residents shared stories of Karen's arbitrary rule enforcement, her selective application of H.O.A. guidelines, and her increasingly erratic behavior. Several homeowners mentioned that they had considered moving because of the hostile environment she had created. Most importantly, we discussed the actual H.O.A. bylaws and discovered that Karen had been operating far outside her legitimate authority for years. Many of her enforcement actions had no basis in the actual covenant documents, and her behavior at official meetings had violated numerous procedural requirements. By the end of the meeting, the residents had voted unanimously to call for a special election to replace the entire H.O.A. board. They also voted to censure Karen for her conduct, and to request that she resign immediately to avoid further legal complications for the association. Karen's response was predictably explosive. She stood up and declared that she would not be bullied out of office by some tech millionaire and his cronies. She accused everyone present of being bought and paid for, and threatened to sue the entire neighborhood association. Then she made her final, fatal mistake. She announced that she was going to take this whole corrupt organization down, and that she had evidence of criminal conspiracy involving me, the city government, and several neighbors. She stormed out of the meeting, but not before declaring that she would be taking this to the federal level, and that we would all be sorry we ever messed with Karen Pemberton. 3 days later, Karen filed complaints with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Justice, alleging that I was operating an illegal surveillance network, that the City Planning Commission had accepted bribes to approve my property purchase, and that the neighborhood H.O.A. election was part of a criminal conspiracy to defraud homeowners. These federal complaints triggered automatic preliminary reviews, which meant federal agents actually contacted me to discuss Karen's allegations. However, the agents quickly determined that her complaints were completely without merit, and that she appeared to be using federal complaint systems to continue a personal harassment campaign. Karen received formal warnings from multiple federal agencies about the misuse of complaint processes, and was advised that continued frivolous filings could result in federal charges for abuse of governmental procedures. But the federal complaints had an unintended consequence that Karen had not anticipated. The preliminary reviews had created official federal documentation of her harassment campaign, her pattern of filing false complaints, and her apparent abuse of various governmental processes to target a private citizen. This documentation was forwarded to local authorities as part of the standard information sharing protocols between federal and local law enforcement agencies. The local prosecutor's office suddenly had a much clearer picture of Karen's escalating behavior and her systematic abuse of legal processes. The prosecutor decided to upgrade the charges against Karen from simple vandalism to stalking and harassment, based on the documented pattern of behavior spanning several months. The new charges carried significantly more serious penalties, and would require Karen to appear before a judge for a formal hearing. Karen apparently realized that her situation had become much more serious than she had anticipated. She hired a new attorney, a criminal defense specialist, who immediately advised her to cease all contact with me and all commentary about our disputes. For about a week, everything was quiet. No more harassment, no more surveillance, no more complaints or threats. I began to think that maybe Karen had finally accepted reality and decided to focus on her own legal problems. Then I received a phone call from my real estate attorney that changed everything. Karen had filed a lawsuit against me in federal court, alleging that my property purchase and enforcement of easement rights constituted a violation of her civil rights under federal housing discrimination laws. She was claiming that my actions were motivated by discrimination against longtime residents, and that I had used my wealth and connections to deprive her of equal access to public accommodations. The lawsuit was clearly frivolous, but it was also expensive and time-consuming to defend against. Karen had apparently found an attorney willing to take the case on a contingency basis, betting that I would prefer to settle rather than spend months fighting in federal court. This was Karen's final attempt to use the legal system as a weapon against me, and it was the most serious escalation yet. A federal lawsuit, even a frivolous one, could drag on for months and cost tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees. But Karen had made a crucial miscalculation. She had filed her lawsuit based on the assumption that I was just another suburban homeowner who could be intimidated by the threat of expensive litigation. She had no idea that I had extensive experience with complex legal matters from my years in the tech industry, that I maintained relationships with some of the most skilled attorneys in the region, or that I had the financial resources to fight her legal harassment campaign as aggressively as necessary. More importantly, Karen's federal lawsuit had opened the door for me to file a comprehensive countersuit documenting her entire harassment campaign and seeking damages for all the costs and stress she had caused me over the past several months. My attorney filed our countersuit within 2 weeks, and it was a masterpiece of legal documentation. It detailed every instance of Karen's harassment, every false complaint she had filed, every act of vandalism and trespassing, and every attempt to interfere with my legitimate property rights and business relationships. The countersuit sought damages for attorney fees, lost time, property damage, and emotional distress, totaling more than $50,000. It also requested injunctive relief to prevent Karen from any further contact or harassment. But the most devastating element of the countersuit was the request for sanctions against Karen and her attorney for filing a frivolous federal lawsuit in bad faith. Federal courts take a very dim view of cases filed primarily to harass defendants rather than to seek legitimate legal relief. Karen's attorney apparently realized immediately that they had made a serious mistake. Within days of receiving our countersuit, he filed a motion to withdraw from representing Karen, citing irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy. Karen was suddenly facing a federal lawsuit without legal representation, with mounting legal bills she couldn't afford, and with a very real possibility of court-ordered sanctions for abuse of the legal system. That's when she made her final, most desperate move. Karen appeared at my front door on a Saturday morning, without her usual pink tracksuit, looking haggard and defeated. She was carrying a manila folder, and appeared to have been crying. "I want to talk," she said simply. "Can we please just talk?" I invited her into my living room, genuinely curious about what she might have to say after months of escalating conflict. Karen sat on the edge of my couch, clutching her folder like a life preserver. "I know you probably think I'm crazy," she began. "Maybe I have been crazy. This whole thing just got so out of control." She opened her folder and pulled out what appeared to be a handwritten letter. "I talked to my doctor, and he thinks maybe I've been under too much stress lately. My husband left me 6 months ago, and I lost my job at the insurance company, and being H.O.A. president was the only thing I had left that made me feel important." I listened without interrupting as Karen explained that she had been struggling with depression and anxiety since her divorce, that she had been drinking more than she should, and that she had become obsessed with controlling her environment because everything else in her life felt chaotic. "I know I was wrong about the cameras," she continued. "I know you had every right to install them. I think I was just angry that you seemed so confident and successful, and I felt like you were judging me." Karen's story was genuinely sad, and I found myself feeling sympathy for her despite everything she had put me through. But sympathy doesn't erase months of harassment, vandalism, and legal abuse. "I'm sorry you've been going through a difficult time," I told her. "But that doesn't excuse the vandalism, the false complaints, the harassment, or the frivolous lawsuit. You've caused me considerable expense and stress, and you've abused multiple governmental systems to continue your personal vendetta." Karen nodded miserably. I know I messed up everything. I just don't know how to fix it now." She pulled out another document from her folder. "I talked to a lawyer about dropping the federal lawsuit, but he says it's complicated now because of your countersuit. He says I might end up owing you money and facing court sanctions." Karen looked up at me with desperate eyes. "Is there anything I can do to make this right? I'll apologize publicly. I'll resign from the H.O.A. I'll pay for the damage to your building. I just can't afford to fight a federal lawsuit." I considered her offer carefully. Karen clearly needed professional help more than she needed legal punishment. But she also needed to understand that actions have consequences, and that she couldn't simply apologize her way out of the legal mess she had created. "Here's what I'm willing to do," I told her. "You resign from the H.O.A. board immediately and publicly apologize for your conduct at the next neighborhood meeting. You pay for all damage to my property and reimburse me for the security company costs caused by your interference. You complete anger management counseling and provide documentation that you're addressing your personal issues." Karen was nodding eagerly. "Yes, I can do all that." "And," I continued, "you sign a comprehensive settlement agreement acknowledging that your harassment campaign was wrong, agreeing to have no further contact with me, and accepting responsibility for all legal costs if you violate the agreement." "What about the federal lawsuit?" Karen asked nervously. "If you comply with all the settlement terms, and there are no further problems for 6 months, I'll agree to mutual dismissal of all federal claims. But if you violate the agreement or resume any harassment, the full countersuit proceeds with additional damages." Karen agreed immediately and signed the settlement documents that afternoon. She resigned from the H.O.A. board by email that evening and sent apology letters to every neighbor she had involved in her campaign against me. 2 days later, she stood up at a neighborhood meeting and delivered a public apology that was both genuine and comprehensive. She acknowledged that her behavior had been inappropriate, that her complaints against me had been without merit, and that she had allowed personal problems to affect her judgment as H.O.A. president. The neighborhood's response was mixed but generally supportive. Several residents expressed appreciation for her honesty, while others were clearly still angry about months of her arbitrary rule enforcement. But the overall atmosphere was one of relief that the conflict was finally over. Karen kept her word about the settlement terms. She paid for all property damage, completed anger management counseling, and had no further contact with me. She also moved out of the neighborhood 3 months later, selling her house and relocating closer to her sister in another state. The new H.O.A. board, elected by neighborhood residents, adopted much more reasonable policies about security cameras, property modifications, and community standards. They also implemented proper procedures for rule enforcement and complaint resolution to prevent future abuse of authority. My security cameras continued to operate without interference, my commercial property remained a sound investment, and my private easement rights were never again challenged. The parking enforcement company reported no further violations once Karen was no longer living in the neighborhood. But the most satisfying outcome was watching the neighborhood transform from a tense, controlled environment into a genuine community. Without Karen's constant surveillance and arbitrary rule enforcement, residents became more friendly and social. Children played in yards without fear of H.O.A. citations. Neighbors began organizing voluntary community events instead of mandatory compliance meetings. 6 months after Karen moved away, I received a letter from her new address. It was a brief note thanking me for handling the situation with more grace than she had deserved, and mentioning that she was doing better with professional help and a fresh start in a new location. I never replied to the letter, but I kept it as a reminder that sometimes the most effective resolution to a conflict isn't total victory over an opponent, but rather helping them find a way to resolve their underlying problems and move on with their lives. The whole experience taught me valuable lessons about dealing with difficult people, the importance of documenting harassment, and the power of community action when someone abuses a position of authority. It also reinforced my belief that most conflicts can be resolved through patience, proper legal procedures, and a willingness to address root causes rather than just symptoms. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that the most devastating revenge against someone who abuses power is not to destroy them, but to remove their power entirely and replace it with systems that prevent future abuse. Karen lost her position, her credibility, and her ability to control others, while the neighborhood gained better governance and a stronger sense of community. In the end, Karen's campaign to force me to remove my security cameras had accomplished the exact opposite of what she intended. Instead of gaining more control over the neighborhood, she had lost all her authority and influence. Instead of driving me away, she had integrated me more deeply into the community. And instead of proving her power, she had demonstrated the limits of what petty tyrants can accomplish when confronted by organized resistance and proper legal procedures. The cameras still monitor my property 24 hours a day, exactly as I had originally intended. But now they watch over a peaceful neighborhood where residents feel safe and respected, rather than surveilled and controlled. And every time I review the footage, I'm reminded that the best way to defeat a bully is not to become one yourself, but to build systems that make bullying impossible for everyone.